Welcome everyone to the Oh the Places They'll Grow webinar. My name is Jennifer White and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Nature Conservancy of Canada in the Atlantic region. The Nature Conservancy of Canada respectfully acknowledges that the work we do across the Maritimes is within the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these lands and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. First off, I have a few housekeeping notes to communicate with you. You may experience a glitch connecting to the live stream. Thank you for your patience. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared via email after the event. Lastly, please use the chat feature to submit questions for speakers. I will read the questions to the speakers during the designated question period. Our guest speakers today include the Director of the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council, Kristen Elton, and the Nature Conservancy of Canada's PEI Stewardship Coordinator, Hannah Ginsel. For those of you who are new to the organization, the Nature Conservancy of Canada, or NCC, is Canada's leading land conservation organization. We work across the country within communities to protect Canada's biodiversity. Our mission is to lead, innovate, and use creativity in the conservation of Canada's natural heritage. NCC has worked to engage communities and volunteers for many years in the care and stewardship of nature reserves. Our Atlantic Regional Volunteer Program provides training and support for volunteers and engages individuals and groups in monitoring nature reserves, locating species of interest, educating communities, and acting as community ambassadors. Our volunteers are an important part of the conservation team. Today's webinar is part of a larger project to engage volunteers in helping to find and map invasive species using Inaturalist. We strive to gain a better understanding of the spread and behavior of invasive species in the Maritimes so that we can improve native habitat for wildlife. Collecting more and better quality data on invasive species using tools like Inaturalist lead to better management of this threat to biodiversity. Our first speaker is the Director of the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council, Kristen Elton. The New Brunswick Invasive Species Council is a network comprised of non-government organizations, government, industry, and recreational partners interested in collaborating on invasive species issues in New Brunswick. Today's webinar is an example of the great work that they do. Welcome, Kristen.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to get my slides up here and share my screen. Wonderful. So, can everybody see that? Are we all able to see? Can I get a thumbs up from one of the people helping out today? Okay, well, until I hear otherwise, okay, wonderful, thank you. All right, so as Jen said, my name is Kristen and I am the Program Director with the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council. So my job today is to go over a bit of a primer on what invasive species are, as well as educate people and help you learn to ID 3 common invasive plant species that we are focusing on in the region right now in partnership with NCC on a few different projects. So we'll get into those in a little bit, but first, just to cover our basis, I just want to give an overview quickly about what invasive species are, because there can be some confusion sometimes. So for something to be invasive, it has to meet 3 criteria. The first is that it's non-native, so it's not originally from here and has been introduced somehow. The second is that it spreads rapidly or the population is hard to control for some reason. And the third is that it's harmful in some way. And this could be harmful to the environment, to the economy. It could have an impact on people, on recreation. And in order to be considered an invasive, it has to meet all 3 of those things. So a good example is something like poison ivy. So poison ivy is actually a native plant. It's meant to be here. It has evolved in this area. And even though it's something we don't want here, it is harmful in some way, we don't consider it invasive. Excuse me. On the opposite end of that, we can consider something like tomatoes. So tomato plants are not native to North America, but we obviously hundreds of people, thousands of people grow them every year. But even though it's not native, we don't consider it an invasive species, because if you were to leave your tomatoes unattended, they're never going to escape the gardens and take over an area. I myself know that I have to try really hard to get them to be successful. So even though they're not from here, we would not consider them an invasive species. So when we're talking about invasives, it's things that are non-native, spread rapidly, and are harmful in some way. And invasive species can be plants, animals, even fungi, pathogens, viruses, bacteria. So it's not limited to plants or animals either. So today, though, we're going to specifically focus on plant invaders. And one of the things that we really look at plants and why they're so impactful is that these invasive plants have what we call a displacement capacity. And that means that they're able to grow to an extent that actually pushes other plant species out. And in doing so, we have a lot of different impacts. And by removing those species, we end up with impacts to biodiversity. Now, I can talk a little bit about that in a second, but how these plants do that, I mean, it's quite impressive. A lot of them have different tricks up their sleeves. So sometimes it's a plant that is introduced and nothing around will eat it. So there's nothing that keeps its population under control. Or sometimes they're plants that have different phenology, which is the fancy word that we use for the timing of when their leaves come out or when their berries ripen. So sometimes invasive plants, a good example of this is glossy buckthorn, which a lot of people might be familiar with in the region. It leaves out earlier in the spring and the leaves stay longer in the fall, which means that it has a longer time and a longer season of growing and storing energy than a lot of our native plant species do, which gives it an advantage. And then some of the other traits that give these plants a displacement capacity is that they're able to tolerate a wide range of conditions. They're able to get in, they see an opportunity, and they're going to be more tolerant to, say, fluctuations in water, or they're going to be more tolerant to drought. Or think of Japanese knotweed. It has really, really strong rhizomes, and it can grow through concrete. Other native plants can't do that. So that gives it an advantage. And all those advantages add up to pushing out other species. So as I mentioned, there are many impacts to that. When we have this increased competition, which is where we have an invasive plant that does much better than our native species, we end up with decreased biodiversity. We end up with decreased habitat for different wildlife species because those native plants are no longer there. And we end up with decreased ecosystem services as well. So these are basically things that the environment does for us that's kind of hard to put a price on, but things like shade that are provided by street trees, or flood mitigation that's provided by wetlands. So when we end up with invasive species that come in, take over and push out our native species, we see impacts to many different aspects of how our environment works. So today, I mentioned that we're going to be focusing on 3 different invasive plant species that we're concerned with, and I can get into why in a little bit, but those 3 are going to be Woodland Angelica, Perennial Sow Thistle, and common reed, or as many people know them as invasive Phragmites. Woodland Angelica and Perennial Sow Thistle, I can guarantee most people have probably seen them. And depending on where you are, you've probably seen invasive Phragmites as well. So we're just going to dive right into this. The first one is Woodland Angelica. And its scientific name is Angelica sylvestris. And I'll make a note that it's important to pay attention to the scientific names when we are looking at invasive species. Well, all species, but with invasives, a lot of the times they're given different names. So Woodland Angelica is sometimes referred to as wild Angelica. When we get into the sow thistle, there's a ton of different varieties of sow thistle, and really focusing on that scientific name is what grounds everything and make sure we're talking about the same thing, even though you know, I might call it Woodland Angelica when someone else calls it wild. It is the same thing. So Woodland Angelica is a plant that it's a tall biennial wildflower, biennial meaning that it flowers in its second year. It's got a large white umbrella-like flower on the top, and it is in the wild carrot family. So other things include Queen's Anne's lace, wild parsnip, cow parsnip, and giant hogweed. And giant hogweed, we do have some of that in the region, and a lot of people confuse Woodland Angelica for giant hogweed, but I'll get into some of the differences in a minute. So this plant is native to Europe and Asia, and it was introduced here, and actually the St. John River area of New Brunswick and Cape Breton, for some reason, seem to be ground zero for this plant. So we're seeing it here, and elsewhere in North America, we don't see it as much, but it is very rapidly expanding within the region. So the other thing to note with this plant, just right off the bat, is that you should avoid contacting it without gloves on, or at least like long sleeve shirts, because it can cause phytophotodermatitis, which is basically a skin reaction to the chemical within the plant. It's not as bad as giant hogweed, but it can still cause a reaction. So we always say, if you're going to be interacting with this plant, gloves and long sleeve shirts. You'll find the plant along rivers, along anywhere where it's wet. So you'll see it along ditches, riverbanks. It prefers those nice wet soils, but we're finding it's doing well in a lot of places. Anywhere it gets enough sun and just enough water. So sometimes it's growing on people's lawns. But the big thing is that it actually spreads through commonly through floodwaters as well. So we had 2 really big floods here in New Brunswick in 2018 and 2019. And this year, being about 2 years after, we're seeing a huge boom in the population because those seeds were able to get so much further than they were previously. So how do we identify it? A lot of people start looking at the flowers right away, but I'm not even going to talk about the flowers because the differences are so minute between a lot of the lookalikes. We're going to focus on the leaves and the stem. So the leaves are the first thing to look at when you come across a plant that you think might be Woodland Angelica. And Woodland Angelica leaves are compound, which means that a full leaf is actually all of these little, what look like leaves. That's a single leaf. These little leaves are actually leaflets. So a compound leaf has all these detached smaller leaflets that make up a larger leaf. And I like to say, to me, they're similar to ash tree leaves. If you think of a fern on the frond, how you've got separate pieces coming off. And it also, to me, kind of looks like a celery stalk when you see it on the ground sometimes. So you can see here holding it, it's kind of bushy, and you'll see a lot of smaller leaf components. So that's a key identifying feature of Woodland Angelica. The opposite, here down in the corner, we've got giant hogweed. This is a single leaf. This is a single lobed leaf, like a maple leaf that just looks much scarier, really, really jagged teeth. But you can see the difference there. They are quite different. And the giant hogweed leaves can get to be up to almost like a foot across. Like they can get very, very large, and everything about them screams, "Don't touch me." I've had people refer to them as dinosaur footprints. They're very massive leaves. But the Woodland Angelica, it's those smaller leaflets that you're looking for, will give you an indication that it's Woodland Angelica. So the other thing with Angelica is to be looking at the stems. So the stems are smooth. They are not prickly. That's a good thing to remember. They can have a purplish hue to them. You can kind of see in this picture, there's a little bit of purple here, but the whole stem can kind of have a purple look. There's no blotches though. So the color is more of an overall color and less of distinct markings. And sometimes they can actually appear waxy as well. So smooth, purpley hue that's not blotchy, and a nice kind of a waxy appearance, that's a good sign that you're dealing with Woodland Angelica. And the one thing I also want to note is that when you're identifying these species, never just look at one feature. You kind of have to look at everything in combined, because, you know, with all the different lookalikes out there, they all kind of have a combination of different things. So you have to put some of these features together in order to get a good positive ID. Now, to give you a sense of the opposite, I have another picture here. This is giant hogweed. So as you can see, the purple blotches look more like freckles or like moles all along it. And you can see those hairs all the way up and down the stem. So giant hogweed is everything about it says, just screams, don't touch me. The spiky stem, the giant jagged leaves, whereas Woodland Angelica, smooth, waxy, and variation in color. So the next plant we're going to talk about is Perennial Sow Thistle. And this is one that I will say off the front, I was not very familiar with it. And I think there's sometimes some discrepancy in what people consider the perennial sow thistle, because there's annual sow thistle, there's common sow thistle, field sow thistle. That's again why we come back to that scientific name, Sonchus arvensis, to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. But this is a tall perennial yellow flower. So that means that it blooms it grows year after year. It's often considered a weed. And historically, if you look it up in terms of invasive information, it's normally considered a problem for agricultural fields, pasture lands, and that kind of thing. It's native to Western Asia and Europe. And where we're going to see it, if you're not a farmer, you'll see it along roadsides. You'll see it in other disturbed areas, some cultivated fields, some meadowlands, and increasingly we're actually seeing it in salt marshes, which is it's one of the reasons why we're actually looking at it specifically. We're doing a project with NCC to kind of get a sense of is this plant a problem for salt marshes, or is it just coming in and there's a few of it, but it's not really pushing anything out. It's not having that displacement capacity. So that's why we're looking and interested in getting information about this species from people. So as I said, there's a couple lookalikes, but the main one that people confuse it with is dandelion. So let's grab a glass of water. The first thing that you can look at to help distinguish this between dandelion and perennial sow thistle is the height. So this is going to be up to 1.5 meters tall, 1 to 4 feet for the people who work in that measurement unit. So quite tall. You'll see it kind of growing up on a roadside. It'll reach over the guardrails. The other thing is that it has a hollow stem that when you crack it, it'll produce a milky sap when it's damaged, and the leaves will do that as well, actually. And then the other thing is that it's smoother on the bottom of the plant, and as you go up to the top, you get more and more of these glandular type hairs along the stem of it. So that's a key thing for sow thistle. Whereas dandelion, you're not really going to get that milky substance necessarily. So the other thing to look at is the leaves. The leaves on a sow thistle will actually grow all the way up the stem. They don't just grow on the ground, whereas dandelion leaves are only going to be growing at the base of the plant where it's attached to the ground. The leaves are really deeply lobed, so you can see, they look like those really almost like a saw. And they do have some spiny edges. Now, this is the thing. Spiny or prickly sow thistle has spinier edges. So just because you see spines doesn't mean it's one or the other. Sometimes it can be subjective. So that's why I put a little asterisk there. The leaves can kind of be variable in shape. And then the other key feature is that the leaves will actually start to be tighter to the stem the higher you go up on the plant. So the leaves down at the bottom here kind of fall from the plant. They're a little bit more horizontal, whereas as you go up the plant, those leaves they clasp the stem a lot more. So here's our dandelion. You can see we're all very familiar with dandelions, that the leaves are only going to grow on the ground. You'll never see them growing all the way up the stem. So the other feature for for sow thistle is the flowers. So sow thistle flowers have more than one flower on each stalk. So we'll get this tall stem and then it branches off into multiple flowers. Whereas a dandelion, you're only ever going to have one flower per stem. The other thing that I kind of noticed when I look at sow thistle is that the flowers look flatter. than dandelions. And they're smaller than dandelion flowers as well. And then the other thing is, and I don't know how to pronounce this, but the involucre, or like the bracts, which is these parts of the flowers here. Notice on the dandelion how it opens up a lot more than with the spiny sow thistle. It actually pinches in. You can see kind of almost like it's cinched in at the waist. It has more of an hourglass shape when you combine it with the flower on top, and they'll be hairy as well. So that's another distinguishing feature. And now this is just an example when I talk about how sow thistle, I see them as being flatter, whereas dandelions, we tend to get more of that nicer domed shape. So the last one that we're going to talk about is common reed, or Phragmites. And this is one that we are going to be doing quite a bit of work on. This is a species that we have seen absolutely devastate areas in the Great Lakes, wetlands elsewhere in North America. And we do have it in the region. It's in Nova Scotia. We do have it in some parts of New Brunswick. We're focused on it as the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council because we want to get an understanding of where it is so that we can try and figure out a way to prevent it from spreading further into the province, which is why we're giving it some particular attention. Now, the tricky thing with Phragmites is that there's a native species and an invasive species, and then sometimes they hybridize as well, just to make everything even more fun. So just a little overview. Phragmites in general, the family, the genus is a tall reed species. So it's a grass, and reed, it's a very stiffer species of grass, and it's got a nice fluffy top to it. The invasive one is native to Europe, and where we see it is along wetlands, riverbanks, and particularly ditches. Basically, if you've ever driven through Ontario, Quebec, even throughout the Chignecto Isthmus in some area in Nova Scotia, you'll just see the ditches act almost like as a highway along for this plant, because they just love those wet conditions, and they're able to just spread right along our roadways. So we're going to talk about how to identify the difference between the two, the native and the introduced. And I will admit that can be very hard. So if you're really interested in this and you want to get involved, and you're out there IDing things and you're completely stumped, worst comes to worst, you take a sample and you send it to us and we try and figure it out for you. But I can give you some tips. So the first has to do with the stand density and the height. Invasive Phragmites they are high density, and they develop a monocrop. So basically they'll go into an area and they will just take over that displacement capacity that I mentioned. And there is no room for any other species. Whereas the native Phragmites, when it is in an area, it'll be mixed in and interspersed with other species. So it doesn't push out anything else. It works more in harmony, I guess. The other thing is that the invasive can be much taller. So it can be up to 5 meters tall. And if anybody's seen photos from Long Point down in Ontario, they're dealing with it that tall. It's absolutely incredible how tall this plant can get. The native species is much shorter. Now, it's hard to say though, when you're just looking at a single one, it's hard you have nothing to compare it to, right? So that's why we look at some of the other features as well. But if you're driving down a highway and you see a clump of this tall grass that's got big fluffy tops on it, and that's the only thing there, that's a good sign that you might want to take a closer look. So once we get closer, what's the next thing? Well, we look at the flowers, or the inflorescence, which is the tops of the fluffy parts. So with the invasive kind, it's much fluffier. And again, it's subjective, right? But the more you see them, you'll really start to notice with the native kind, it's fluffy and it's interspersed, but really the invasive, there's many more florets, which is each of those tiny little pieces of the flower. And especially as the flower matures, it does get much fluffier. Now, the other thing to note is that the invasive kind of Phragmites is more rigid. So it'll actually, and it also holds up a lot better over winter time. So if you're driving around in May, June, before the natural time that these come out and flower, which isn't until, August, September, and you see fluffy flower tops on Phragmites, those are actually old dead stalks from last year. And you're really only going to see that when it's invasive, not when it's the native kind, because the native aren't as rigid. So those flower stalks, they just kind of disintegrate and deteriorate throughout the winter months, whereas the native one maintains those flowers. So that's a really good giveaway. If you're driving around in May or June and you see something that you think is Phragmites, it's most likely invasive if it's still got those flower heads. The next thing to look at, if you're getting even closer, is the stems. So key things to look at are the texture. Invasive Phragmites are much rougher, and whereas the native can be smooth and almost shiny or glossy. The color is another thing. Invasive are more yellowish brown, whereas the native can actually have reddish to purple coloring on the lower parts of the plant. I've already mentioned the invasive is a stiffer plant, quite rigid. And the reason for that is that the leaf blades, so, we see the leaves here, and then they continue down and they wrap around the plant, are much tighter to the stem, which gives it that rigidity. So, I've heard of people playing, they play sword fighting with these Phragmite reeds because they're that stiff. The other thing that's a good distinguishing feature is because on the native plant, the leaf blades and the sheaths don't actually aren't as tight, they will fall off with age. So they will be loose on the stem, particularly the older ones down at the bottom, and they will fall off with age. And because they're looser, you're also more likely to see the nodes, which are the areas along the reed where you kind of get that bump, or it almost looks like a joint. You'll feel those on the native one, whereas you won't see it on the invasive, because the invasive just has those leaf sheaths so tightly wrapped around the plant. And then my time's running out, but if you're really, really close, really avid, and you want to learn more, the other big thing to look at, one of the more the up close and personal kind of identification is looking at the ligule, which is the area of I'll show you, this would be the ligule here, where the blade actually attaches to the stem. That's what we call the ligule. If you pull one of those off, there's going to be a thin band around where it attaches. Now, the invasive species is very, very thin. We're talking this tiny, tiny dark line, whereas the native, it's a little bit thicker. But again, even to the trained eye, it can be hard to identify. But you can also look at the rhizome. So the rhizome is what gives the invasive Phragmites and a lot of invasive plants their power, because this is how they spread most of the time. And invasive Phragmites, even though they have seeds, it's mostly through the spread of rhizomes that they are actually having such an impact. And the rhizomes are basically, they're not the roots, they're underground stems. And from those, new shoots can grow up. So this is an example of a rhizome. And if you were to pull up a chunk of rhizome from what a Phragmites stand that you're trying to identify, at the sections, so again, those nodes, or the joints as I like to call them, you cut open an invasive. If you saw it in half, it's going to be compressed, and it's going to be more like an oval, whereas with the native, it's going to be more round. Now, if you're really invested into this, you're really interested, the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center has a fantastic identification guide that goes into a ton more detail, and hopefully that can provide you more information. But as I said, these do also hybridize with each other, which makes it more difficult. And sometimes it's just impossible to tell. So if you are really interested, and we are looking for people to participate and help us get observations of this plant in particular, you can get in touch with us, and we can help you with some more ID tricks. So with that, I believe that is the end of my section. I think I only went 5 minutes over, but I will pass it on to Jen.
Thank you, Kristen, for the amazing and informative presentation. That was great. Our next presenter is NCC's PEI Stewardship Coordinator, Hannah Ginsel. Hannah worked to steward NCC's PEI nature reserves while building community support and volunteer engagement across the island. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you, Jen. I'm just going to get my screen up and running here. All right, is that visible? I'll assume yes and continue, and one of the organizers can let me know if not. So as mentioned, my name is Hannah, and I'm going to be speaking more generally about how we can expand our knowledge of these wetland invasive species using citizen science. So for many of you, this might be your first introduction to some of these wetland invasive plants that were highlighted by Kristen. And now that you're armed with knowledge, you may find yourself distracted by plants on the side of the road that look suspicious. I know I certainly will be. So tuning into these invasive plants and identifying them when you see them is really important, and it helps us understand the full extent of an invasion, how these plants are spreading, and where they're having a big impact. However, we do run into a few issues when we're trying to fully map out where these plants are. One being that we need to cover huge areas to get a full understanding of where these introductions have occurred. These plants are really great dispersers. They can disperse through water and through the air, so that's an issue for sure. We also need to look at long-term changes, so we need to be monitoring over a long period of time. And we need to have a ton of experts out in the field who can quickly find and confirm these invasive plants. So it's a ton of effort to overcome those hurdles. And in a perfect world, we would all just have one of these dogs. There are detection dogs that can sniff out and identify invasive plants. Unfortunately, we all don't have our own trained detection dog. But what we do have, more realistic solution, is citizen science. So citizen science, my favorite definition would be that it's using the strength of communities to build on scientific knowledge. So it involves many people over an expansive area and over really long periods of time, working toward the goal of collecting information and data. So that really solves a lot of our problems with mapping out these invasive species. So there are many different platforms to do different types of citizen science, but I'm going to be focusing on iNaturalist today. It's one of the most widely used platforms, specifically for identifying species, both wildlife and plants, and all kinds of organisms. But we're going to be focusing today on iNaturalist being used in the context of invasive species monitoring. And what iNaturalist does is it allows us to take a photo observation of a species, and we upload it where it will be confirmed by other users and experts. So, oh, there we go. So we're going to run through this process here using an example. So let's say you've seen this plant on a wetland or on the side of the road, and you're not quite sure what it is. Maybe it's sow thistle, maybe it's the perennial sow thistle, but maybe not, you're not sure. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to iNaturalist. You can go to the website or the app. iNaturalist.ca is the Canadian subset of iNaturalist, or you can use the app directly on your phone. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'll just be showing screenshots from the website just to keep things simple. But you can sign up. It just takes an email and you make up a username and that's it. And this is what you see when you log in. There's a lot going on the screen, but there's a lot you can do. So you can search for species, you can type in Woodland Angelica, and you can see exactly where other observations of Woodland Angelica are, which is really neat. And there are other features here as well. You can explore and go to the community section and look at the forums, but we're going to be focusing just on the upload button right now for the purposes of running through the process of uploading that photo. So you're going to take the photo and it's going to be beautiful. You're going to take close-ups and you're going to take photos from far away. So you want a sense of scale, especially for something like Phragmites. But then you also want to hone in on specific features as well. So you want to make sure you're getting the leaves, the stem, the flowers, and all those kind of main points of connection, just to make sure you're getting all of those key features. And it helps that we've had an overview now of what to look out for. So that helps a lot. And you can take as many photos as you'd like. A key thing would be to make sure you have the location. So with your phone, this is pretty easy. You can take it directly in the app and it'll automatically pull the location for you through the GPS in your phone. But you want to make sure that you have location on. You can also just take a photo with your phone not in the app if you're offline, and you can upload it later. And if you have a camera, you can take your photo with your camera. You may need to jot down GPS coordinates from a GPS unit if you have one. So the specific location is really important because it allows us to map these out. So when you go to upload, this is what your screen looks like. And you'll click the add button, or you can just drag your photos right in. It's pretty interactive. And you'll see your photo here, beautiful perennial sow thistle flowers. And it comes up right away when you click on the species name. That drop-down box will suggest things for you. So it'll look at your photo and it'll say, oh, that looks like perennial sow thistle, and that's the first suggestion. And it also tells you if it's been seen nearby, which is really handy. So you would click that if you think that's the best guess as to what it is. You'd click on that and that will fill in for you. There's also some additional information here on the left side. So if it's a photo from your phone, it'll pull the date automatically in your location. But then you can also add in notes. So this is really handy when we're using Inaturalist in an invasive species context, because there's a lot of important details that we don't necessarily get from the observation itself. So you could add in how dense the plants are. You could add in if they're in flower. You could add in where they were found, like what's the habitat like there, all kinds of information. And then you'd hit submit, and you can add multiple observations in the same run through. So then you'll see your observation pop up and it'll look like this. You'll see all your photos that you've put in, and you'll have your guests, and then other users can come in and they can add in if they agree with your identification. So there's other users and experts who will come through and check on these observations. And once you have a couple people agree, at the top, you'll see that the observation is research grade. So there'll be a little banner that indicates that it is confirmed that it is what it is. And you'll also see a little exclamation mark with, Inaturalist will automatically flag for you when a species has been introduced. So it recognizes the species name, and the area where we found it we know it's been introduced via anthropogenic means, which is really cool. And finally, you can also see a little map here, and you can see where your observation was, but you can also see where other people have found it as well, which is really neat. You can kind of get a picture of if there's a cluster all in one spot, or if it's kind of spreading throughout the area. So I'll just briefly talk about projects in Inaturalist as well. And this is a really useful tool for invasive species management. And so this would be an example of the invasive species in New Brunswick. This would be a project created by the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council, and it would show you basically a full list of all the invasive species within this specific region. So people, organizations, and other groups can create these projects to make a collection of observations. And you can search for these. There's the New Brunswick one, but there's also one for Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island as well, created by the Invasive Species Councils for each province. So you can go in there and you can look at all the observations, and there's a huge amount of observations in there. Over 8,600 have been logged. So it's definitely an effective way to collect a huge amount of data. And an important thing to note would be that any observations that you're uploading, you don't have to do any extra work. It automatically adds them to your local council project. So you don't have to do any extra tags or anything to make them part of that project. But you can also join the group manually if you'd like. And what that does is it gives you notifications if there's other observations of a species in your area. So. All right, so to wrap up, we'll just go over how this actually helps invasive species efforts. And the big thing is that it provides reliable data to scientists, groups, and organizations. And it's verifiable as well. So we can go in, we can look at the photos, we can double check, and it's all remote, like experts who can't necessarily be everywhere at once can come in and check on those photos and confirm whether or not we're seeing an invasive species. It's pretty slick process as opposed to going out there and looking for themselves. And it becomes really clear where the edges of invasions are when we have mapping tools like this, because we can see where invasions are and where they're more likely to continue to spread. And the more we know about these plants, the more we can evaluate their impact on native plant diversity. So that's really key when it comes to our knowledge of these invasive species. All right, so thank you so much for listening. And I'll just give a quick plug to those of you in PEI who will be visiting, or if you'll be visiting PEI next week, we'll have an event hosted by NCC on the new Mossy Point property that we have in Prince County, where we'll be using Inaturalist to identify native and invasive species, and we'll be mapping and pulling some perennial sow thistle. So if you would like to get your hands dirty, or if this sounds like something you'd be interested in, you can reach out to me directly at hannah.kienzle@natureconservancy.ca. And that is on Wednesday, August 25th from 9 a.m. to noon. So with that, I will pass it back to you, Jen.
Thank you, Hannah, for this interesting presentation on a very useful tool. I will now read questions that have been submitted by our presenters. There are questions from our guests. There are questions for each presenter. The first question and comment for Kristen is from MB Whitcomb. And it says, the leaf in the photo is different than ours in our Cape Breton plant. Can you please share the presentation? And then the second question, how did you pick these 3 invasives out of the hundreds of invasive plants?
Sorry, so I guess I'll just might have to clarify which of the 3 plants you're talking about versus in Cape Breton. But I can talk to why we chose these 3. So as I mentioned, with Woodland Angelica, it's a unique one to our region, and there's not a lot of information existing on its spread, how we're expecting it to spread, because it's nowhere else in North America. So we're working on a project to develop a management guide for that one as well, so that we can share it with practitioners on how to get rid of Woodland Angelica, how to deal with it, what to expect if it shows up. So that's why we want to focus on Woodland Angelica. Also getting some information out there on how to identify it, because it is so often confused with giant hogweed and some of the other lookalikes that we field, dozens of questions each season around this time of year as everything really starts to come out in full bloom. So just to try and get that information out there. For Sow Thistle, we're interested in looking at that one. Again, we're working with the Nature Conservancy of Canada because it has in the past and in other regions affected mostly agricultural fields. It's commonly considered an agricultural pest, but we are seeing it in salt marshes. And given that, there's quite a bit of work being done in salt marshes, it's kind of a different area that people are seeing it than what they're used to. So we want to know exactly where it is in the region. Is it mostly is it thriving in these salt marshes, or is the majority of it, again, just in pasture lands and that kind of thing? It is a salt tolerant plant, which explains why it would do well in a salt marsh, but really we're just not sure what its impact is going to be. So that's why we focused on that one, and we're trying to get more information. And, the more citizen scientists we have, contributing data, the better off we'll be. And then, as I alluded to with the Phragmites, this is one that we have seen, as I said, it gets into wetland areas and it just takes over, and significant decreases in biodiversity and bird life. And in New Brunswick, we're particularly interested in it because we have an opportunity to do something to try and prevent it from spreading even further than where it is. Because right now in New Brunswick, there's some spots sporadically, but the majority of it is clustered around Moncton, between Moncton and Sackville, and then into Nova Scotia. So we're seeing it kind of come in on a leading edge. And what we want to know is, how far exactly is this plant into New Brunswick? How extensive is it? Same thing with PEI, so that we can figure out areas that we actually want to target for maybe removal in the future, or doing targeted outreach. So that's why we chose those three species, because they pose different unique things individually as well.
Great, thank you, Kristen. Just a reminder for anyone that does have questions, we have one more submitted, but if anybody else has questions, feel free to put your question in the chat, and I can read it to our presenters. So I have another question here from my guest for Hannah. Should I take pictures of other plants while I am looking for these invasives? And should I take pictures around my house or just in the wilderness? So 2 questions, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. So to answer the first, should I take pictures of other plants? Absolutely. So that's why I mentioned that Inaturalist is, because it's so widely used, it encompasses more than just invasive species, right? So people are going out and taking pictures of plants and wildlife. Occasionally it picks up rare species, which it has a built-in feature that the location gets blurred just to protect whatever species you're looking at. But it's really helpful to have all that data in there, even if it's not invasive, because there are species being used for other projects as well by other researchers outside of an invasive species context. And then could you repeat the second half? I forget.
Sure. Should I take pictures around my house or just in the wilderness?
Sure, yeah, and then I guess to add to the location thing, you can take pictures around your house. A lot of people do, but you can also obscure location if you don't want to show where your house is or your cottage or wherever you're taking those photos. But absolutely, yeah, you can take photos anywhere, along roadsides, in parks. I've seen a lot along trails. So sometimes you can even see where trails are when people are walking, and they'll just snap photos all alongside the trail sides. So you can take photos anywhere, even in like city centers too. So it's all useful.
I can also just add to that. We encourage people to do that wherever you are, whether it's, I mean, I'm on my iNaturalist app in my backyard, even just figuring things out. But that's the nice thing about the mobile version with the iNaturalist app, is that it's so easy to use out in the field. And even if you're not within data range, you can still take the photo, put in the information, and it'll just wait until you are within cell range or Wi-Fi to actually upload that information. But yes, just wherever you go, take as many photos as you want, to submit it anywhere. That's what we would really encourage. But the other thing I just wanted to point out, and I should have mentioned it, is one of the main ways that a lot of these invasive plant species spread is through getting stuck to equipment or boots. You know, when you're walking your dog, the seeds get stuck to them and they go, and you go to the next trail and they fall off, and that's one of the vectors that they spread. So if you are in a patch of Woodland Angelica or you're looking at Sow Thistle, make sure when you're taking these photos that you're not taking anything else along with you, these pieces of this plant, because you don't want to be spreading them any further. So we do have a program called Play Clean Go, which is aimed at, you know, getting people to make a habit of brushing off their boots and stuff, as, you know, before and after they hit the trails. But particularly if you know you're in a patch of something that's invasive, make sure you're not taking any of it with you.
Thank you both. A few more questions have come in. One comment and question from Haley Hutchin. Hello, great presentations. Why is purple loosestrife not a target species? It seems quite extensive in Sackville especially. I used Inaturalist for purple loosestrife and for roadkills or wildlife that have been struck by cars. Inaturalist for all observations is awesome. I guess this one maybe for Kristen.
Yeah, I can actually, we get that question a lot. So purple loosestrife is kind of one of the poster childs of invasive species. And back in the 70s, 80s, we saw it get into Ontario and absolutely devastate areas in Ontario. It is here in the Maritimes, but it is not as extensive as of an impact as we saw in Ontario. And part of the reason for that is because one of the ways that they've come to developing controls of purple loosestrife is actually a biocontrol. So basically a beetle that has been researched that goes in and eats the purple loosestrife, but then won't become an invasive species itself, was actually released in the Maritimes here in New Brunswick ahead of the purple loosestrife arriving. So there's thought that that actually has helped control the population. So yes, we have it, but it doesn't get to a point where it's completely taking over everything. Now, that's not to say some areas don't have more of it than others. And those are certainly areas that we should be, you know, you should be highlighting if you do notice it. But the short answer is that it's not having as much of an impact here as we have seen it have elsewhere.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question for Kristen. Is the common reed the one that the Acadians used to thatch their houses? Is that how it got here? Not sure if you know the answer to that or not.
I do not, but I can say that I don't. So I grew up in Ontario on the shores of Georgian Bay on the Great Lakes, and Phragmites is something that has really taken off there since like the 90s and the 2000s. So, and we are seeing it spread that way. And as I said, most of it spreads through rhizome. I don't know about that. I would assume that it wasn't the invasive one. Just historically, I don't think it has been in the region that long, but that's something I will have to look into.
Okay, and I just have time for one or so more questions. This is kind of a big one, but how do I get rid of invasive species?
Well, depends on the species. Sometimes you can't. The best thing with invasive species management is preventing it from getting here in the first place. Which is why we focus a lot on public education about taking those steps to make sure you're not bringing things along with you accidentally, along with what we call early detection and rapid response, which Hannah touched on a little bit. As soon as something is identified, getting action happening right then and there, because it's a lot easier to deal with it when the problem's small. A lot of invasive species, so for example, Woodland Angelica, purple loosestrife, if it's in an area, these are species that once their population gets to a certain size, we're never ever going to be able to get rid of them. It's just a matter of management. And there's different ways that you can manage an invasive species. You can manually try and manage it, pulling it. You can use chemical management, whether it's herbicide, pesticides, insecticides. biocontrols, as I said, you know, introducing or encouraging a population of something that actually does eat these or help keep them under control. Yeah, it's a lot of work and it really depends on the species, but if there's particular ones that people are interested in, you feel free to get in touch.
I will also, if I can just throw in here, a lot of the management that we've been doing has been mostly manual. So it does also depend on where you're removing the species. For example, like wetland invasive plants, there are often regulations around chemical applications in and around waterways. So that's really important. So don't go out spraying Roundup on purple loosestrife or perennial sow thistle if it's in a marsh, or that's something that we take into consideration when we're managing something is how can we best manage this in a safe way. So
Great, thank you. Maybe one more just very quick question. Tracy Tanaka, I swear I saw purple loosestrife in the ditch. Do I have the right to pull it if I confirm what it is? Kristen.
I will have, again, I have to check. I mean, I'm sure the folks that manage the roadways aren't going to complain that you're helping them get rid of the vegetation there. It has to do with property ownership. We also don't want to encourage people to just haphazardly pull off on the side of the road and just because it's a safety hazard. But I don't believe there's any, rule that says you can't. But of course, if you're out in front of somebody's house or somebody's property, you're going to definitely want to get permission from the landowner. But that is something that we do work with the Department of Transportation. And I can ask them about that. If, the public sees it, would it be frowned upon to go out and pull it?
Great, thank you. We've received a number of questions, so thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we won't have time to get to them all today. But please, if you want more information about the project, for additional questions or comments, please email me at atlantic.volunteers@natureconservancy.ca or contact the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council. I would like to welcome now a volunteer on NCC's Atlantic Regional Board to thank the presenters and supporters and to send us off. Welcome, Anne.
Hello, everyone. I want to first acknowledge the excellent presentations that have been delivered today virtually by some real experts in the field, and we're very fortunate to have their knowledge and their expertise amongst us, and it was very informative and very educational. So thank you to all of you. Also, thank you to Mark for organizing and facilitating really a flawless technology, the flawless technology here. I'm not done yet, so we shouldn't say that too quickly, but certainly really great. Of course, I'm really thrilled to be involved with the Nature Conservancy of Canada as a volunteer. But everybody, I'm guessing, if not most people on this webinar, have a love of nature as I do, and volunteer and pay attention, either within NCC's efforts or within organizations in efforts on your own. So thank you for your volunteerism and for your conservation heart. That's really, really important. We're doing important work collectively. So specifically around this project and projects that many experts are involved in, want to acknowledge three particular organizations that have provided ongoing support for important work like this. In terms of the webinar specifically and donors to coordinate this webinar today, I want to thank the New Brunswick Wildlife Trust Fund for supporting the mapping of invasive plants in New Brunswick. I want to also thank TD Friends of the Environment Foundation for supporting the Citizen Science Project in PEI for community members to map invasive species. Finally, thank you to Atlantic Lottery Corporation for supporting opportunities to volunteer for nature through our reinvesting in our communities program. So real leaders on environmental initiatives, and we're very fortunate to have them formally involved. This project, I think, as had been mentioned earlier in the webinar, is a joint effort with the New Brunswick Invasive Species Council. And of course, we're very grateful to partner with them in combating the spread of invasive species. They are one of quite a number of partners that we have that we work with in this regard. Just a phenomenal work that they do each and every day, and so well represented today, of course, through various presenters on this topic. I think the final thank you really goes out to the incredible volunteerism that the Nature Conservancy of Canada has throughout Atlantic Canada. And, 50 years running in Atlantic Canada, it's incredible what the organization has been able to accomplish. And there's never been a more important time to look forward and to keep conservation at the heart of what we do. The last 2 years or year and a half has taught us anything, it's really reinforced the value of and importance of nature, and of course, how important it is to conserve and preserve it. So thank you all. It's been an incredible afternoon and presentation, and I thank you for your valued time today.
Thank you, Anne. We welcome all of you to take the skills that you've learned here today and go explore in the field to help locate and map invasive species in the region. Thank you all again for participating. For more information on this topic and how to become an NCC volunteer, please contact me at atlantic.volunteers@natureconservancy.ca. Happy hunting, everyone.